Welcome to all of you here in the room with us and those of you dialing in. I have my first direct encounter with the international climate effort was back in 1992 as a journalist covering the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. Later attended the Kyoto Conference as a member of the U.S. delegation. And some of the COPs that followed that as well. And for, I guess, 14 years now, have been continuing to observe these negotiations on behalf of this organization, C2ES, formerly the Pew Center. As Laura mentioned, we had the privilege of convening an informal dialogue among senior negotiators over the past couple of years, which really gave us a ringside seat on some very formative discussions. These were very candid, constructive discussions, which led to a fair degree of convergence among the participants on some of the core elements of a Paris Agreement. That was captured in a report from the co-chairs of that dialogue process. I believe you have copies in the packet, those of you who are here with us in the room. And in the months since we released that report back in July, we've seen growing convergence in the political level discussions among ministers around many of those same elements. I think what we've also seen in the run-up to Paris is really a rising political will among many of the major players. I think the strongest evidence of that is the joint statements we've seen from the U.S. and China, traditionally viewed as adversaries in this context, at this stage are joining forces to lead the effort toward a successful outcome in Paris. And another piece of evidence, I think, is the wave of INDCs, intended nationally determined contributions, that we've seen come forward ahead of Paris, and I'll say a little more about that later. We have rising political will. We have, I think, stronger convergence on the broad contours of an agreement than we ever saw ahead of the Copenhagen conference, for instance. So I think the basic ingredients are in place. There's still an enormous amount of work to be done translating that will and convergence into treaty text. So the negotiators definitely have their work cut out for them, and there's still a lot that can go wrong in the kitchen. But hopefully in Paris we'll have some master chefs with us, and we will achieve that successful outcome. So I'm going to be walking through this handout that Laura's distributed to you. If you turn to slide 3, I think it's always useful to start with a bit of history, and apologies that for the minuscule font on this particular slide, but I was very proud of myself for condensing 2 decades of history of the international climate effort into a single slide here. So as I said, we've been at this since 1992 with the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, established the foundation for the global climate effort. At this point, virtually every country on Earth is a party to the Framework Convention, including the United States. It was signed by the first President Bush and ratified with the advice and consent of the U.S. Senate. The convention did a number of things. It set a long-term objective, stabilizing greenhouse gas concentrations at a level that avoids dangerous human interference with the climate system. It committed all countries to taking mitigation efforts to reduce or limit greenhouse gas emissions. It committed developed countries to provide support to developing countries, and it established a core principle, common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, fondly known as CBDRRC, and something that we return to over and over again in these negotiations. Now, since '92, the global effort has evolved in different directions. And in fact, what you have in place right now are actually 2 parallel frameworks under the convention. The first is the Kyoto Protocol, negotiated in 1997, which took the regime in a more top-down direction with binding emissions targets for developed countries. The second framework is a more bottom-up framework that came out of the Copenhagen and Cancun conferences, which instead of a binding system, it instead set a system where countries could enter voluntary pledges. And you have pledges now from nearly 100 countries, accounting for the vast majority of global emissions. Both of these approaches have demonstrated some virtues, but when you sort of step back and look at them, you see in the case of Kyoto, while you have strong legal and technical rigor, you have shrinking participation. When it came time for a second round of targets under Kyoto, other countries fell away. As we know, the U.S. was never a party, so that the protocol, while it's still in force, covers just a little more than 10% of global emissions at this stage. And then this parallel Copenhagen-Cancun framework, while it did achieve much broader participation, the pledges on the whole are fairly weak and don't put us nearly on the pathway to the 2-degree goal. So again, we see some benefits, but neither one of these is getting the job done. If you look at that next slide, that nice schematic, it shows sort of the spectrum I've been talking about, with top-down and bottom-up at either end. Kyoto you see closer to the top-down end, and Cancun at the other end. And really what we're aiming for in Paris is what we refer to as a hybrid approach. Something that combines top-down and bottom-up elements to balance, on the one hand, national flexibility, on the other hand, international discipline, with the goal of achieving both broad participation and strong accountability and ambition. So I think if you were to try to express this as a conceptual construct, that's, and probably not one you'd want to share with your readers or listeners, that's what we would offer, this hybrid paradigm combining top-down and bottom-up elements. Turning to slide 5, every time parties kick off a new round of negotiations, there's a formal mandate framing that negotiation. In this case, that came in 2011 with the Durban Platform in Durban, South Africa, which essentially called for a legal agreement applicable to all parties to be reached in 2015 and to apply from 2020 onward. Not a whole lot of substantive framing, frankly, in that mandate, leaves most of the issues pretty wide open. But in the course of those negotiations, parties introduced what will be a very significant element of the agreement. That is a new construct called intended nationally determined contributions, and invited parties to submit those well ahead of Paris. And that phrase, nationally determined, is really key, and that reflects the flexibility part of this new hybrid paradigm. Countries are free to decide for themselves the form of their contribution, the level of their contribution, even the time frame of that contribution. And at the time this was established, it was very clearly and explicitly without prejudice to the ultimate legal character of those contributions, something I'll come back to. So I think if the intent of that flexibility was to achieve broad participation, it has already succeeded. You'll see on slide 6 that so far we have INDCs from more than 160 countries, accounting for more than 90% of global emissions. And you see a great diversity in the types of contributions being offered. From all of the developed countries, we see absolute economy-wide targets, as they've offered in the past. A couple of developing countries for the first time are also offering absolute economy-wide targets, Brazil and South Africa. But for the most part, from developing countries, you see different types of contributions, either intensity targets, reductions of emissions per GDP, or what we call BAU targets, reductions of emissions from projected emission levels under a business-as-usual pathway. Most of the countries have picked 2030 as their target date, a few exceptions, including the United States, which has set its pledge for 2025. Many of the contributions from developing countries are at least in part conditional on receiving some international support, and many countries have indicated that they intend to use international market mechanisms to achieve their goals. Moving on to slide 7, one of the reasons parties were encouraged to get their contributions in early was so that everyone could take a look at them and size them up and see how they stacked up against one another and what they all add up to. And when you do add them all up, you see that they move us closer to the 2-degree goal, but not all the way there. This particular graph comes from the Climate Action Tracker, which has projected that on a business-as-usual pathway, without this new round of INDCs, we'd probably be looking at warming of about 4 degrees Celsius by 2100. And they project that with the INDCs, if they are fully implemented, we could bring that down to 2.7 degrees. Other projections are not quite as optimistic. I've seen them going up as high as 3.5, but they all agree that collectively these contributions, if fully implemented, will bend the curve down from where we're headed at the moment and bring us closer to that 2-degree goal. So that's the picture with respect to the contributions, the individual contributions that countries are bringing to Paris, but those need to be attached to an agreement of some sort. So let me just quickly walk through some of the key issues under negotiation. First, the question of a long-term goal. The 2-degree goal was set in Copenhagen and Cancun, and I would expect that Paris would reaffirm that goal, but there's also strong interest in translating it into a more action-oriented goal. For instance, earlier this year, G7 leaders called for decarbonizing the global economy in the course of the century. So we could well see language of that sort in the Paris Agreement. A major issue, I mentioned the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, basically the distribution of effort across developed and developing countries, a perennial issue and a core issue in these negotiations. I think it's very safe to say that the Paris Agreement will rely much less heavily than past agreements on the sort of stark binary differentiation between developed and developing countries that we saw, for instance, in the Kyoto Protocol. So it will rely much less on categorical differentiation. And with this new notion of nationally determined contributions, what you get when those contributions come in is really a natural de facto self-differentiation. They fall along a spectrum as countries define for themselves the type and level of contribution they're offering. So I think that that self-differentiation will apply, but with some parameters. I think we can look to the Paris Agreement to set some expectations. It will respect that parties have different starting points, but it will set the expectation that all of them are putting forward their best efforts and that those efforts will progress over time, strengthen either in the form or in the level of contribution. So this is a much more nuanced approach to differentiation. Moving on to slide 9, another key issue is the legal form or character of the agreement. As I said, the mandate called for a legal agreement. I expect that the outcome, at least the core agreement within the Paris package, will be a legal agreement, will constitute a treaty under international law. The really critical question, though, is which elements of the agreement will be binding. Within a legally binding agreement, some provisions may be binding and others not. And this question centers primarily on targets. Will countries' emissions targets be binding? The United States and many other countries do not favor that, and I would not expect that at the end of the day the targets will be binding. What I would expect is to see a set of binding procedural commitments. In other words, requirements that countries inscribe and maintain nationally determined contributions, that they report on their implementation of those, and that they periodically update those contributions. So those are the types of things that I would expect to see as binding provisions under the agreement, but not the targets. So if the targets aren't binding, that raises the question of how countries will be held accountable, and I think that will be primarily through strong transparency. We have a number of transparency mechanisms already under the convention, but from the start, those have been differentiated between developed and developing countries, stronger requirements for developed countries. I think what we're likely to see coming out of Paris is a transition toward a common or single transparency framework that would include all countries. It would have some flexibility built into it to allow for differences in capacities among countries, but the expectation would be that all countries are working toward the same standards of transparency and accountability over time. They would be expected to submit reports on their emissions and on their actions, and those would be subject to some form of international review or international scrutiny. Another perennial issue is finance support to developing countries. As most of you probably know, developed countries committed in Copenhagen and Cancun to mobilize $100 billion a year in public and private finance by 2020. A recent OECD report suggests that they are on track toward that. A major issue in Paris will be whether or not to establish a new numerical finance goal beyond 2020. So far, developed countries have been strongly resisting that. Another major issue on finance is whether the agreement will serve to broaden the circle of contributors, the base of donors, so that the onus is not entirely on developed countries. And we saw a very important signal from China in the recent joint U.S.-China statement in September. For one thing, China pledged $3 billion toward a new South-South fund that it's set up to help developing countries. But if you look at the language in that joint statement, you'll also see that it calls for encouraging countries willing to provide contributions to do so, which signals that China is prepared to accept language of that sort in the Paris Agreement. So I expect that we'll see that, and that will serve to broaden that circle of contributors and encourage countries like China that have the wherewithal to provide contributions as well. Slide 10, starting with the question of adaptation. Historically, the international effort has focused much more heavily on the mitigation side of the equation. How do we reduce emissions? Very strong push from developing countries to put greater emphasis this time on adaptation. How do we cope with climate impacts? So I think the agreement will likely set some kind of long-term vision for adaptation, create some expectation or obligation that countries will be submitting national adaptation plans and reporting periodically on their efforts. A related question is loss and damage. Even if we do a really good job with both mitigation and adaptation, there are certain impacts that are unavoidable. We've baked a certain amount of warming into the system already that will lead to sea level rise. What do we do about those kinds of impacts? How do we help countries that are going to be facing these unavoidable and in some cases rather severe impacts? That's the question around loss and damage. I expect that it will be addressed in some fashion in the Paris Agreement, but the clear message from the U.S. and other developed countries is that they are not going to open the door to any notion of liability or expectation of compensation based on liability. So that's their red line, and parties will need to find some way to address this issue without crossing that red line. Finally, the question of ambition. As I said, we know that the numbers on the table heading into Paris will not put us on a pathway to the 2-degree goal. So how will this agreement credibly address the question of ambition? And the likely answer is that it will set an expectation or an obligation for countries to come back periodically, probably every 5 years, to take stock of collective progress. How are we doing? Are we moving toward our goal? And to require that countries at that point offer up new or updated contributions. So you'll have this cycle that will require countries, bring countries together, create another moment of political pressure for countries to put numbers on the table with the expectation that they are progressing their efforts. So coming to the last slide, slide 11, what does this all mean? Why does Paris matter? Will it be a success? And I think whether you define it as a success depends on your criteria. And I think that we know already that on the basis of some of the conventional criteria, Paris would likely be judged to be falling short. We've talked about the 2-degree goal, that it won't immediately at least put us on that pathway. We've talked about the fact that the targets likely won't be legally binding, which for some people might be a measure of success. But I think that the kind of agreement that we see shaping up for Paris, in fact, could constitute a major turning point in the global effort and potentially could be transformative. We can see the possibility for the first time of a balanced and durable framework that gets all of the major players on board, that provides for strong accountability, and that works to promote rising ambition over time. As I said earlier, we see rising political will coming into Paris. The agreement is an opportunity to capture that political will and convert it into a set of multilateral arrangements that can work to strengthen the political will going forward. To me, what a lot of this is about is building confidence. With greater confidence that others are contributing their fair share to the global effort, we all can do more. That greater confidence leads to stronger political will within domestic contexts, enabling each country to bring more to the table next time. So what I see emerging from Paris is a set of binding procedural commitments that are meant to hold countries' feet to the fire. A framework that establishes a series of moments when countries are expected to be upfront with the global community to say what they're going to do, and then to show whether they're doing it, and then to say what they're going to do next. And through that way, I think Paris has the possibility of setting in motion a virtuous cycle that can bring us closer to achieving our climate goals.